The professor stopped mid-sentence, chalk still raised, and looked past the projector screen toward the back row of the seminar room. "Excuse me," he said, in the tone of a man who had said that phrase 1,000 times and never once doubted his right to say it. "This is a closed defense. Are you here for someone?" Every head in the room turned. The man in the back row did not move. He sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him, a worn canvas jacket still zipped to the collar, and he said nothing at all. Nobody in that room was watching the small woman seated in the far corner, half behind a filing cabinet, a leather notebook open on her knee. That was their first mistake. Nobody had introduced him. Nobody had asked his name before deciding he probably didn't have a reason to be there. The professor's voice had that particular brightness people use when they believe they are being reasonable, when they believe the question itself is the generous part, a courtesy extended before the harder question, the one about calling someone to escort you out, becomes necessary. The room was Kessler University's East Seminar Hall, the kind of room with oak paneling old enough to have absorbed a century of nervous throat clearing, reserved twice a year for doctoral defenses that mattered. 14 chairs, one long table at the front, a projector humming through its cool-down fan, and a candidate named Priya Desai standing at the podium with 40 months of research compressed into 18 slides. It was 9:04 in the morning. The defense had been running for 4 minutes. The tall man in the back had not yet said a word, and already the room had decided who he might be. The words moved through the chairs like weather, low and certain, lost, maybe. Security. Somebody's ride. Nobody had asked him. That was the second mistake, though nobody in the room had counted the first one yet, and wouldn't for another hour. Marcus Hale had walked onto campus at 8:40 that morning, still smelling faintly of surgical scrub and cold coffee, because his shift at Ridgeview Memorial had ended at 6:15, and he had not gone home first. He had a 9 o'clock, and 9 o'clocks did not wait for a man to shower and change into something that looked more like what people expected a doctor to wear. He wore what he always wore when he wasn't in scrubs: dark jeans, work boots, a jacket with a small burn mark on the left cuff from a Bunsen burner incident in his second year of residency that he'd never bothered to have repaired. At 6'4" and built like a man who had spent his 20s doing manual labor before medicine ever entered the picture, he did not read, to strangers, as someone who spent his nights with his hands inside another person's skull. He had learned a long time ago that most people decided who he was within 4 seconds of seeing him, and that almost none of those 4-second verdicts were generous. He had stopped correcting them out loud. He corrected them, instead, by simply continuing to exist exactly as he was and letting time do the rest. He'd found a seat in the back because the back was where he always sat, not from shyness but from habit, a habit built over 14 years in operating rooms and briefing rooms and courtrooms where testimony mattered. Sit where you can see the door, sit where your back has something solid behind it, sit where you can watch every hand in the room. He wasn't there by accident, and he wasn't there to make noise. Dr. Amara Okafor, the university's dean of medicine, had asked him personally to sit in on Priya Desai's defense because Marcus's own 5 years of clinical data on traumatic brain injury recovery patterns had become, without much fanfare, one of the 3 datasets on which Priya's entire dissertation was built. He was not an auditor. He was, as far as the actual substance of the room was concerned, one of the people the room existed for. He had simply never been given a name tag, and he had never once in his life worn one on purpose. He watched Priya's hands, the way they trembled faintly around the clicker, and thought, not for the first time, that nerves were the most honest thing in any room, more honest than diplomas, more honest than posture, more honest than the assumptions people made about a man's hands based on the size of them. He remembered his own defense, 9 years earlier, in a room not unlike this one, and the particular quality of silence that had settled over it while he waited for a committee of 5 to decide whether 4 years of his life had amounted to anything worth keeping. He had promised himself, somewhere in that silence, that if he was ever on the other side of a room like this one, he would remember exactly how it felt to be the person standing at the podium with everything on the line, and he had kept that promise every time since. quietly, without announcing it to anyone, the same way he did most things that mattered to him. He had learned, over the years, to let the assumption run its course before correcting it, because correcting it too early only ever bought him a different kind of scrutiny, the kind where people apologized too much and then watched him even more closely, as if his credentials were a magic trick they were determined to catch him performing. So he let the room think what it wanted to think for as long as the room needed to think it. It rarely took long. It usually took exactly as long as it took someone to actually need something from him, and then the room recalibrated all on its own, the way rooms always eventually did. His own hands were a story nobody in that room could read. There was a hairline scar across 2 knuckles on the right one, thin as a hair, from a piece of shattered glass 11 years ago in a trauma bay in Kandahar, back when he was Major Hale and not Dr. Hale, before the second career began on top of the first one nobody talked about. He kept a single fountain pen in his breast pocket, an old habit from residency when a steady, practiced hand was a professional requirement rather than a personality trait, and he used it now to write in tight, small block letters, the way surgeons write, because loops and flourishes were what people did when their hands had nothing at stake. He noticed things. He noticed that the projector bulb was dimmer in the left corner. He noticed that the third chair from the door had a wobble nobody else seemed to hear. He noticed, 4 minutes into a 9 o'clock defense, that a small woman in the far corner had not once looked at her phone, had not once shifted in her seat, and had opened a leather notebook the exact moment the professor cleared his throat for the first time, as if she had been waiting, with some patience honed over years, for exactly this kind of morning to begin. Claire Ashworth had been on campus since 7:50, and she had already been mistaken for 3 different people by 3 different members of staff. The woman at the security desk in the lobby had asked her, kindly enough, if she was here to pick someone up from the after-school program that didn't exist at a university, and had needed to be told twice that no, she had an appointment with the graduate school's Office of Research Integrity, before that woman finally checked her badge and went faintly, apologetically pink. It happened almost everywhere Claire went, and it happened so consistently that she'd stopped being surprised by it around age 11. People's eyes landed on her height first and did all their thinking there, before her face, before her badge, before a single word left her mouth. At 4'3", she had spent 38 years learning exactly how much of a room's attention she could hold in total silence, and the answer, she had discovered, was almost all of it, the instant she chose to use it. She had walked into the seminar room 11 minutes before Priya Desai clicked to her first slide, chosen the seat in the corner without being shown to it, and set her leather notebook, a small, cracked, brown thing that had crossed 4 continents with her and had never once been photographed for a magazine profile, though several had asked, open on her knee. She did not introduce herself to the room. That was not an oversight. It was a policy, one she'd refined over a decade of sitting in rooms exactly like this one. People behaved more honestly around a person they hadn't yet decided mattered. She wrote a single line in the notebook before the defense began. Not about Priya's research, not yet, but a private note to herself, in handwriting nobody in the room had ever seen and would not be shown today either. She had a habit of writing things down before she needed them, the way some people kept a lighter in their pocket on the off chance of a cold night. She rarely showed anyone the page. Today would be no exception. She had also learned, long before she ever set foot in a university lecture hall, exactly how a room's temperature changed the instant someone decided to underestimate her, and how useful that change could be if she simply let it happen instead of rushing to correct it. People spoke more freely around someone they'd already dismissed. They forgot to lower their voices. They let their real opinions surface in the gaps between sentences, the way water finds the cracks in a foundation nobody thought to check. Claire had built an entire method of listening out of other people's carelessness, and she had never once regretted the years it took to learn it, because the alternative, correcting every assumption the second it was made, would have cost her the very thing that made the correction, when it finally came, land as hard as it did. There was a second habit, less visible than the notebook, that nobody in that room would have noticed even if they'd been looking directly at her. She counted exits. not out of fear, but out of the same instinct that made her read a room's temperature before she read its agenda, a holdover from a childhood spent being physically underestimated in ways that occasionally turned dangerous before they turned merely rude, and a decade of professional life spent in rooms where the people who controlled the money controlled everything else besides. She had counted 2 exits in the seminar hall before Priya Desai had finished setting up her laptop. What the room did not know, because nobody had thought to check the credentials attached to the small woman with the plain gray cardigan and the scuffed flats, was that Dr. Claire Ashworth held the Whitcomb Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience at a university 2 states over, sat on the review board of the Halloran Foundation, the single largest private funder of exactly the kind of longitudinal brain injury research Priya Desai had spent 3.5 years compiling, and had been invited to this defense not as a courtesy but as the external examiner whose signature, more than any other in the room, would determine whether Priya's research center saw another cycle of funding at all. She had reviewed the dissertation twice already, in full, over 2 long nights the week before, and had arrived with 11 pages of notes, none of which anyone in the room yet knew existed. She had also, in the 11 minutes before the defense started, quietly clocked the tall man in the back corner, recognized something in the stillness of his posture that most people mistook for menace, and she recognized as discipline, and made a private note about him too, one she had no intention of sharing until it became useful. Professor Alan Whitfield had built his career the hard way, and he never let anyone forget it, least of all himself. He had grown up the son of a machinist in a town 2 hours from Kessler, the first person in his family to finish college, let alone earn a doctorate, and he had spent 30 years turning that hunger into one of the most rigorous doctoral programs in cognitive science on the eastern seaboard. His office, 3 floors above the seminar hall, held exactly 1 photograph. His father, in grease-stained coveralls, standing in front of a machine shop that no longer existed, a shop Whitfield had spent every summer of his adolescence sweeping floors in so that his father could afford the tuition deposit for a state school nobody in their family had ever attended before him. He had never once, in 30 years on that campus, told a colleague the whole story of how he'd gotten there. He believed, sincerely and without irony, that rigor was the only real form of respect a mentor could offer a student, that letting weak work through the door because you liked the person presenting it was its own kind of cruelty, dressed up as kindness. He had failed exactly 4 candidates in 22 years as committee chair, and he considered each of those failures a mercy extended to the field itself. He was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one, in the specific way that men who have clawed their way somewhere are frightened, terrified that the door he'd fought so hard to get through might, at any moment, swing open for someone who hadn't paid the same price, and that the whole structure he'd built his identity on top of would turn out to have been arbitrary all along. He had a habit, well known among his colleagues, and gently mocked behind his back, of arriving to every defense 20 minutes early to personally check the guest sign-in sheet by the door, as though the integrity of the entire academic enterprise rested on knowing precisely who had wandered into a room they hadn't been formally cleared to enter. His wife had once told him, half joking, that he treated every seminar room like a border crossing. He hadn't found it funny, mostly because he suspected it was true, and mostly because he had never once considered that a border crossing was itself not a neutral thing to model an entire professional identity on. That fear, more than any conscious malice, was what made him glance twice at the man in the back row that morning and feel something tighten behind his sternum, an itch he had learned, over 3 decades, to trust without questioning it, though he had never once, not consciously, called that itch by its real name. He saw a jacket with a burn mark on it. He saw hands that looked like they'd done something other than turn pages for a living. He saw a man who had walked in 11 minutes ago and said nothing to anyone, hadn't signed the guest log at the door, hadn't been introduced by the dean's office the way visiting faculty usually were. In Whitfield's mind, in the space of about 4 seconds, all of that assembled itself into a story, and the story had a shape he recognized from 100 other mornings. Someone who had wandered in, Or worse, someone who had no earthly business being in a room where a young woman's entire academic future was about to be decided by people who had, in his accounting, earned the right to decide it. The defense proceeded through its first 3 slides without incident. Priya's voice found its rhythm around the 5th minute, the way voices do once the opening tremor burns off. Marcus watched her hands steady. Claire's pen moved twice, small, unhurried notes. Then Priya advanced to her 4th slide, a chart comparing recovery trajectories across 3 data cohorts, one of which was labeled, in small print at the bottom corner, Hale, M. Ridgeview Longitudinal Series, and Whitfield's eyes drifted, not for the first time, toward the back of the room, toward the man whose name was quietly sitting on the screen 12 feet from his own understanding of who deserved to be there. "I'm sorry," Whitfield said, and this time he didn't clear his throat first. "I have to ask. Sir, in the back. This is a closed proceeding. Do you have a reason to be here?" Marcus didn't answer right away. It wasn't defiance. It was the same half-second pause he gave every question in every trauma bay before he moved. The beat where he decided whether the situation required force or patience, and chose, as he almost always chose, patience. The silence stretched 2 full seconds, which in a room like that felt considerably longer. "I do," he said finally. 2 words, nothing else. "Would you care to share it?" Whitfield said. And it wasn't phrased as a question anymore. For a moment nobody moved. The projector fan kept humming, oblivious, the way machines always are to the temperature of the rooms they sit in. Somewhere down the hallway a door closed, ordinary and distant, and the sound seemed to arrive from another building entirely, another morning, one where none of this was happening. Priya had stopped talking. The clicker sat forgotten in her hand. 2 of the other committee members exchanged a glance that tried, and failed, to look neutral. Marcus held Whitfield's stare without heat, without apology. The exact stillness he'd learned to hold over a bleeding patient when the family in the hallway wanted him to hurry, and hurrying was the one thing that would kill someone. He said nothing further. He had never in his adult life felt the need to announce himself to a room in order to have the right to sit in it. That was the first false floor. Whitfield, sensing resistance rather than composure, mistook the silence for confirmation of his worst assumption, and something in his shoulders set. "I'm going to need you to step out," he said, "or I'm calling security." It was Claire who stood. She stood the way she always stood in rooms like this, without theater, without raising her voice, simply rising from the chair in the corner with the small brown notebook still closed in one hand, and the room's attention, which had been entirely fixed on the 6'4" man being asked to justify his existence, found itself, for the first time all morning, redirected toward a woman most of them hadn't clocked as present at all. "Before you call anyone," she said, "I'd like to understand the question you're actually asking him." Her voice was quieter than Whitfield's, and the room leaned in half an inch to catch it, which was, as it happened, exactly what she wanted it to do. "You've asked him twice to justify being in this room. You haven't asked anyone else that question this morning. I'm curious what's different about him." Whitfield turned toward her with the particular impatience of a man being interrupted by someone he hadn't planned for. "And you are Claire Ashworth," she said, and offered nothing further, the same way Marcus had offered nothing further, because neither of them believed a title was owed to a question asked in that tone. One of the committee members, a junior faculty member named Dr. Reyes, who had been sitting closest to the door, shifted forward as if to say something, then thought better of it and sank back into her chair. She would tell a colleague, weeks later, that the worst part of that morning hadn't been Whitfield's questions. It had been the 11 seconds of total silence in the room while everyone waited to see whether anyone besides the small woman in the corner would say anything at all. Nobody else had. That silence, more than the questions themselves, was the part of the story Priya Desai would remember longest. "I'll need to see identification from both of you," Whitfield said, and the second false floor dropped open beneath the room, because now it wasn't only the tall man in the back who was being asked to prove himself. It was the small woman who'd had the nerve to speak on his behalf, and something in Whitfield's voice suggested he found that development, if anything, more irritating than the first one. Two of the committee members shifted in their seats. Priya Desai, still standing at the podium with her presentation frozen on the fourth slide, looked, for the first time that morning, more afraid for the two strangers in the room than for herself. She thought, absurdly, of raising her own hand to vouch for a man whose full name she didn't even know, and then thought better of it, because some part of her understood, even in the panic of the moment, that this wasn't a fight either of them needed her to fight for them. "Professor Whitfield." The voice came from the doorway, and every head turned again. Dean Okafor stood there with a folder under one arm and the particular expression of someone who has walked in half a beat too late to prevent something but early enough to correct it. "I see you've met Dr. Ashworth." Whitfield's certainty, which had held its shape through two challenges already, wavered for the first time. "Dr. Ashworth, Claire Ashworth," Okafor said, stepping fully into the room now. "Whitcomb Chair, Cognitive Neuroscience. She sits on the Halloran Foundation's review board, the foundation funding this entire research line, Alan, including the grant renewal your department is depending on for the next 3 years. She's your external examiner today. I invited her personally." A pause, just long enough to let the sentence finish landing. "I assumed someone had introduced her when she arrived. Nobody had." Whitfield's mouth opened slightly and produced nothing. Priya Desai's hand had gone very still around the clicker. Claire said nothing at all. She didn't need to. The silence was doing more work than any sentence could have, and she had learned decades ago that the loudest thing in a room was often the thing nobody expected to hear at all, which was nothing. Whitfield turned, slowly, back toward the man in the back row, the itch behind his sternum now a cold, spreading certainty that he had made an error, though he did not yet know the full size of it. "And you," he said, and the sentence had lost its earlier edge entirely. "You're with Dr. Ashworth's party." "No," Marcus said. Before Whitfield could ask the obvious next question, the door opened again. A research assistant, breathless, phone in hand. "Dr. Hale, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Ridgeview's on the line. They need you back for the Kowalski consult. They said it can't wait for the defense to finish." "Dr. Hale," Whitfield repeated, very quietly, as though testing whether the words would rearrange themselves into something that made more sense if he said them slowly enough. His eyes went, almost involuntarily, to the fourth slide still glowing on the screen behind Priya's shoulder. "Hale, M. Ridgeview Longitudinal Series." The name that had been sitting in the room since the 4th minute, in 12-point font, unnoticed by the one man whose entire objection had been that this man didn't belong there. Marcus stood, unhurried, the way he did everything. "Chief of Trauma Neurosurgery, Ridgeview Memorial," he said, to the room generally rather than to Whitfield specifically, the same flat, unbothered tone he'd used for his first 2 words 20 minutes earlier. "Dean Okafor asked me to sit in because roughly a third of Miss Desai's dataset came out of my department. I didn't think that required an introduction." He looked, for just a moment, toward Priya, whose eyes had gone bright and wet at the podium, and something in his face softened by exactly 1 degree, the only visible reaction he allowed himself all morning. "Your 4th slide is good work," he told her. "The recovery curve in Cohort 2 is the strongest thing I've seen out of that data. Finish your defense." Whitfield's face had gone through 3 distinct shades in under a minute. The ash white of realization, a blotchy red that crept up from his collar, and finally something closer to gray, the color of a man doing rapid, humiliating arithmetic in front of an audience. He opened his mouth, and for the second time that morning, nothing useful came out of it. He was not, in that moment, a villain enjoying his comeuppance. He was a frightened man watching 30 years of self-mythology collapse in the space of 90 seconds, in front of the one student whose defense he had genuinely wanted to protect, and the 2 people he had least expected, a chief of neurosurgery and an endowed chair holding his department's funding in her hands, turning out to be the very people he had spent the morning trying to remove from the room. Somewhere underneath the humiliation, something else was moving through him too. Something he wouldn't be able to name until much later that night, alone in his car in the faculty parking lot, replaying the morning for the 40th time. It wasn't only that he'd been wrong about 2 people. It was that he had built an entire professional identity on the belief that he could read a room's worth in 4 seconds, and that belief, the one thing he'd trusted more than his own resume, had failed him in front of the one student he had wanted, more than any other in years, to see succeed. Marcus looked once toward Claire. She had already turned back toward Priya, her notebook still closed, as though the last 4 minutes had been a minor procedural interruption rather than the unmaking of a man's entire morning. She did not look back at Marcus. She didn't need to. Whatever passed between them passed the way it always did, without a word, without a glance held a beat too long, the simple mutual understanding of two people who had spent their whole lives being underestimated in the same rooms by different versions of the same fear, and who had just, without discussing it beforehand, corrected the record in under 2 minutes and moved on. The room took a moment to remember how to breathe normally. Dr. Reyes, the junior faculty member by the door, quietly closed the folder in her lap, as if putting something away that no longer needed to be held open. Whitfield sat down, slowly, in the chair nearest the projector cart, and for the remainder of the defense he asked exactly 2 questions, both of them careful, both of them stripped of the certainty that had carried his voice 20 minutes earlier. Nobody in the room mentioned what had happened. Nobody needed to. It sat in the air the way smoke sits in a room after a fire has been put out, invisible to a stranger walking in fresh, unmistakable to everyone who'd been there for the flame. Priya Desai finished her defense 40 minutes later. She passed, unanimously, with revisions Claire Ashworth would later describe, in her formal written evaluation, as minor and largely stylistic. The kind of language that, in that world, was closer to a standing ovation than a critique. Whitfield signed the approval form last, his handwriting noticeably smaller than it had been on the sign-in sheet that morning. He did not apologize to Marcus in front of the room. He found him afterward, in the hallway outside, waiting by the elevator, and said something quiet that nobody else heard, and Marcus said something back that was even quieter, and neither of them told anyone what was said because it hadn't been said for an audience. Claire and Marcus found the elevator at the same time. 10 minutes after that, in the emptying hallway with its century of oak paneling and its fading morning light through the tall windows. Neither of them had planned to leave together. It simply happened, the way certain things simply happen between two people who have just, without any prior arrangement, moved through the same fire side by side. "You didn't have to stand," Marcus said as the elevator doors closed. "I know," Claire said, "would have handled it." "I know that too." She looked up at him. A genuine upward tilt of the chin, the angle she'd navigated her entire life, and there was nothing apologetic in it. "I didn't stand up for you. I stood up because he asked the wrong question, and somebody in that room needed to make him hear it out loud." A small pause. "You'd have done the same for me. You were already deciding whether to." He didn't answer that, because she wasn't wrong, and there was nothing left to correct. Behind them, back in the seminar room, Priya Desai was gathering her laptop and her printed slides into her bag, her hands finally steady, and she would tell her partner that night that the strangest part of the entire morning wasn't the reveal itself. It was how quickly the room had gone back to normal afterward, how easily everyone had simply continued with the business of the defense, as though a man's entire authority hadn't just been publicly, briefly, unmade and remade in the span of 90 seconds. She would remember, more than anything else, the 2 seconds of silence before Marcus answered the first question, and the 11 seconds after Claire stood, and how in both of those silences, nobody else in the room had said a single word. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened onto the lobby, onto the ordinary Tuesday traffic of students and coffee cups and backpacks, none of whom knew or cared what had just happened 3 floors above them. Marcus held the door a half-second longer than the elevator required. Claire stepped through it first, the way she always did, not because anyone made room for her, but because she had long ago stopped waiting for rooms to decide she belonged in them before she walked through the door herself. "Same time next semester?" she said, without turning around, already 3 steps ahead of him toward the exit. "If they'll have us," Marcus said. "They will," Claire said. "People like him always ask us back. It's easier for them than sitting with what they got wrong." She said it without bitterness, the way a doctor might describe a symptom she'd seen 1,000 times before, not as an accusation, just an observation filed away in the same notebook, alongside everything else she'd learned not to be surprised by. Marcus considered that for a moment, the way he considered most things, without rushing toward an answer just because one was expected of him. Maybe, he said, or maybe he actually learned something from it. Some of them do. Some of them do, Claire agreed. She didn't sound convinced, and she didn't sound like she needed to be. It wasn't her job to fix Whitfield. It had never been her job to fix anyone in those rooms. Her job, this morning and every morning like it, had simply been to make sure the truth got said out loud by someone, so that the silence didn't get to write the whole story by itself. Outside, the campus had moved on entirely without them. A groundskeeper trimming the hedge along the quad, 2 students arguing cheerfully about a shared thesis advisor, a food truck setting up its awning for the lunch rush that was still 2 hours away. None of it had paused for what happened upstairs, and there was something in that ordinariness that both of them, in their own separate ways, had learned to find steadying rather than diminishing. The world did not need to witness a correction for the correction to matter. It only needed to happen. Neither of them smiled, exactly. But something passed between them in the wide sunlit lobby that no committee, no title, no 4 seconds of first impression would ever fully account for. The particular unspoken understanding of 2 people who had learned, long before they ever met, that the size of a person in a doorway has never once told you the size of what they carry inside it. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting.